It's Wednesday, July 14th, 2021. My name is Ashton Ellett, here with another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library for Political Research and Studies at the University of Georgia. Here today with Richard Royal in Camilla, Georgia. A proud graduate of Georgia Tech, Mr. Royal is a business leader of long standing here in Southwest Georgia. Most recently, he was president and CEO of Royal Petroleum Products. He served for a decade on the Camilla City Council before winning a special election to the Georgia House of Representatives in 1983. He would go on to serve as state legislator for the next 25 years. During that time, he held top posts on committees such as Appropriations, Ways and Means, and State Planning and Community Affairs. As such, he is a recognized expert on tax policy, agriculture, and rural affairs. Richard, thank you very much for having Robert and me here in beautiful Camilla, Georgia.
We appreciate this opportunity to communicate with you.
I know we're both looking forward to it. So let's just begin. Tell me a little bit about your childhood and upbringing. You grew up here in Mitchell County?
I was born in Albany, 27 miles away, and moved to Camilla when I was 1 year old with my parents. I've been here ever since. Went to public high school here in Camilla, graduated in 1957. From there I went on to Georgia Tech, where I graduated in 1962. I've had various career opportunities. My dad owned the local poultry processing plant here and one in Gainesville, Florida also. So I grew up in the poultry industry, in agriculture.
Right. So I wonder, growing up, your father is in the poultry industry. Was your family a political family? Were they involved in politics or interested in the local politics of the area or the state?
Not so. We did not get involved in politics. I think my dad one time ran for some office and and was unsuccessful. So we have not been political. I was sort of recruited for my first political experience with the local city council here. I was in Winter Haven, Florida one day on poultry business, received a phone call from the mayor and city manager of the city of Camilla, and was requested by them to run for the city council. I almost hung up on them. I told them I wasn't interested, I was not a politician, and that was the end of that conversation. They continued to pursue me, and finally I consented to run for that office. Went out one day campaigning, and as I was walking up to the house, I heard the people inside, "Oh no, there's another one." That pretty well ended my campaign. I went back home. I never tried anything else to get elected, but I won the election.
Maybe more people these days should emulate your campaign style.
Right.
So tell me, so you were still working in the poultry industry. Was that still a family-owned poultry business during that period?
That's correct.
So tell me about the poultry industry in Southwest Georgia, because like most people, I'm familiar with poultry in North Georgia. I was less familiar that there was much of a poultry industry in South Georgia.
The poultry industry was really remote down here at that time. And unlike the big poultry integrators today, most of the people that supplied the poultry, the chickens that we processed, owned the chickens. We bought them from the farmers. But now the big integrators own all of the chickens. They contract with the farmers, the growers, to produce them, but they own the chickens. But we bought them. We bought them from Alabama, from Florida. We bought them from all over Southwest Georgia, and brought them here to Camilla and to Gainesville, Florida, and processed them there. But we processed something like around 60,000 poultry products a day, or chickens a day, and that was at that time. That was a lot of volume.
Right.
We were one of the largest employers in Southwest Georgia. So, and we had a real good working relationship with the employees.
So when did you transition away from poultry and into some of the the other job pursuits that you'd have later on?
I think I left the poultry industry somewhere around 1974, as best I can remember. I bought the local Ford dealership here in town, and I was still employed. We had sold the poultry industry to another concern, Kegel, in Atlanta, and I had worked for them for several years, and I decided I wanted to have my own business. So
Sure.
I bought the local Ford dealership and had that for about 10 years.
Right, right. So, looking at when you went to Georgia Tech and came back, was your plan always to come back to Camilla after graduating from Georgia Tech?
No, I never did think much about that. While I was at Georgia Tech the last 2 years, I became employed by a building contractor and worked part-time for them. When I graduated from Georgia Tech, I became a building contractor on my own, and I built some 21 houses in northeast Atlanta.
Really?
And my daddy was financing me.
Okay.
So he made the decision for me to come back to Georgia. He called me one day and said, I want you to finish up those houses and come back home. I'm starting a mobile home factory.
Mm.
And I said, yes, sir. And I didn't pay any attention to him. I just kept on building. And in about 2 weeks, he called me again. He says, I thought I told you I wanted you to close it down. And I said, well, I sort of enjoy what I'm doing. He says, well, your financing is not available anymore. So I finished up building the houses I had under construction, and I came back home and joined the mobile home effort.
Right. Well, when the money runs out, you
That's
got to
right.
do something.
When you can't control your finances, you do what you have to do.
That's right. That's right. So let's talk about your time on the Camilla City Council. You were sort of dragooned into running by folks in the town. What sort of issues were facing the city council, or was the city government dealing with back in the 1970s, early 1980s?
Well, the city of Camilla was always fortunate in that we owned our electrical distribution. Unlike a lot of
Right.
small towns like Pelham in Mitchell County, the Georgia Power owns their electrical
Sure.
distribution. That was our money base, and we were able to finance most of our operation on that. We were in a transition then. The demographics down here, the black-white population was always close to 50-50 in Mitchell County. Mm-hmm. In the city of Camilla, it was probably a larger minority majority in the local council. So I guess redistricting was one of the big issues. And as a council, we decided that we should do the right thing and go ahead and pattern the council on the population of the demographics.
Sure.
And we did that voluntarily. Nobody made us do it. We did that, and it was really good. And we've always had good race relationships here in Mitchell County, and we've had a black chairman of the county commissioners for years.
Right.
We have, I think we have a 3 white, 2 black commission in Mitchell County. They elect their own chairman, and they have continuously elected the black chairman, and he's done a great job. We have great race relationships here, and I think it all goes back to our apportionment by the city councilman years ago in developing this fairness that we tried to strive to do.
You're talking about demographics. What was, because if we look across South Georgia, Middle Georgia, population change over time, the trend going back to the Great Depression and the New Deal is shrinking rural populations and out-migration to cities and other states. What's it been like in Mitchell County, Camilla, in terms of absolute population numbers over the years?
The population numbers, the best that I can remember, is it's been stable to the point of, I think it's probably on a small decline right now.
Right.
But it's been pretty stable at the current populations. that we see now. As I came along, there was not any opportunity for young people. As they graduated from high school, they graduated from college, there was really nothing to bring them back home. We had agriculture as our number one industry, and we've lost a lot of good talent in our young people because there was no opportunity here.
Right. Well, that's something we'll talk about a little later when we talk about your time in the legislature. Speaking of which, did you wind up running for the state legislature the same way you ended up running for city council? Were you recruited for that seat? Or there was a vacancy. I know that.
That's right.
How did the seat come open?
Well, then Representative Marcus Collins was representing Mitchell County and Colquitt County in the legislature. Governor Joe Frank Harris appointed him state revenue commissioner. That made the seat open. This time nobody recruited me. This time Richard Royal decided I want to try that. And this is a true story. I went to the church every morning and got on my knees around 7 o'clock. And I prayed to the good Lord that don't let me do this if this is not in your will. I never got that message not to do it. So I went ahead and did it. It was a real interesting race. I ran against the then chairman of the Mitchell County Board of Commissioners. I think he had been chairman some 18 years.
And this is Mr. Autry?
That's right, Mr. Autry. He was more or less anointed by Marcus Collins, the outgoing state representative. I never did see any evidence where Mr. Collins got involved in the election. He was pretty well on the sidelines, neutral. Mr. Autry and I campaigned. It was a very clean campaign, nothing like we see today. And it was a close election. You know, it wasn't until the last votes came in, which were the city of Camilla, that and I think I won by a margin of some 125 votes.
That is a close
Very
election.
close. Mr. Autry was gracious. He called me. There were no challenges to the recount or anything like that. He wished me well, and we got along. And several years later, I passed legislation to name the prison down in Pelham, Georgia, the Autry State Prison.
Okay.
So,
that's where that name comes from then.
Right, right. So, you know, that election was very, very open, nothing ugly.
Right. So tell me, how much time had you spent at the Capitol before you were elected to the General Assembly?
The day I went up to qualify for this House seat in 1983 was the first time I had ever entered the state capitol. And that's a true story too. You know, we live 200 miles from Atlanta. As a young guy, I went to Georgia Tech up there, but you know, politics was the last thing on my mind when I was in Georgia Tech. So I never went to the state capitol, never visited it.
So what was it like being a freshman legislator in the 1980s?
Well, the first day of the session, of course, my seat was on the very last row in the back of the chamber, and we were called on to stand up for the pledge of the flag. And I was standing there pledging to the flag, and I was looking over all of these individuals down in front of me. I had a great view because everybody was in front of me.
Right.
But I saw men and women that I'd seen on TV quite often. I mean, they were institutions. I saw Tom Murphy, the longest serving speaker. And the first thought that came through my mind is, Richard Royal, what are you doing here with all of these people? But you know, as a freshman back then, you were not expected to speak up or anything.
Right.
Freshmen did not go to the well of the House and debate legislation. We were expected to sit in our seat, listen, and learn, and hardly to be seen. and you know, that was expected. It took me 11 years to become a chairman of a committee. everything was on seniority back in that day. It was
Right.
primarily one party,
Sure.
the Democratic Party at that
Mhm.
time. There were, I think there were less than 20 Republicans on the floor of the
Sure.
House. And, you know, we had our debates, we had our differences during the day. At night, everybody was friend again.
Mhm.
Everybody, you know, it was a great fellowship. But you didn't have many rights as a freshman, and as the next 4 or 5 years, you had to earn your stripes.
Sure.
And
Well, you mentioned Tom Murphy. So tell me about Tom Murphy and your impression of him and your working relationship, and obviously it changed over time. But what was your first impression of Tom Murphy, the speaker?
I had gotten the impression prior to going to Atlanta that he was a big bully, and that it was hard to live with him. I went up there with the attitude that, you know, he was not going to bully me. I would stand my ground. And I did for a couple of years. He had a piece of legislation dealing with Tom Moreland. He and Tom Moreland had a...
This is the GDOT commissioner.
That's
Tom
right.
Moreland, yep.
Commissioner of the Department of Transportation. They had a running feud. And
That's right.
Speaker Murphy had introduced legislation which would strip GDOT of its funding source. The sales tax for education was dedicated to the Department of Transportation, and the legislature could not
Right.
touch that money. So Speaker Murphy was going to strip that funding source from DOT and let the Department of Transportation be totally dependent on the way the state,
On the appropriations
the
process.
House of
right?
Representatives wanted to distribute the money. Speaker Murphy asked me personally to support the legislation, and I looked him in the eye and told him I couldn't do it. And there were a couple of years there that life was difficult. I had great relationships with Commissioner Moreland, and he started paving everything in southwest Georgia that I asked for because I had sided with him in this dispute. But finally, Commissioner Moreland called me in one day, and we had a difference on some other funding. And he asked me why I didn't call him before I made an interview in the Poultry paper, disagreeing with him. And things got worse in the conversation. I finally said, you asked me why I didn't call you. I said, does that phone on your desk ring out? And at that point, I had another representative sitting with me, Representative Alan Sherrod from Thomas County. And he couldn't get out of the meeting fast enough to run and tell Speaker Murphy that I had sort of severed ties with the DOT commissioner. And I was coming in the building the next day and happened to get on the elevator with Speaker Murphy, who had rarely spoken to me up until then. He put his arm around me and he says, son, I hear you and Mr. Moreland disagreed yesterday. And from then on, I was a fair-haired child of Murphy. I got back into good graces. I lost my paving, but anyway, I already had most of it paved anyway.
Right, right. So you talked about your disagreements. You're talking out of 180 seats, only 20 or 30 Republican at that time. So what were the dividing lines within the dominant Democratic caucus? Was it purely rural versus urban, conservative versus liberal? What were those dividing lines like within the Democratic caucus?
I don't think it was so much conservative versus liberal. I think it was geographic. Most of the Republicans were metro area.
Sure.
And they didn't understand agriculture. They didn't understand our way of life. And it was an honest misunderstanding.
Okay, so we were talking about the dividing lines within the Democratic Party, dividing along geographic lines, and then you were talking about Republicans and understanding agricultural rural issues.
Right. I was about to say thank goodness for Johnny Isaacson. Johnny Isaacson was a Republican, one of the leaders. I think he was the minority leader at that time of the House. Johnny Isaacson was a communicator, and he would intentionally listen and try to resolve issues. And we became close friends. Johnny was I served on the committee, State Planning and Community Affairs Committee with him. We became friends. We would try to cross these bridges of difference as they occurred. And he was a peacemaker in the Republican Party, so we didn't have many partisan battles back in those days. Most of the battles were Democrat against Democrat.
Right.
And city against country.
Right.
And, the urban legislators, Democrats and Republicans, did not understand agriculture. They had the best of all worlds. They had the economy. They had Atlanta International Airport up here. They had everything going for them. The agricultural community was struggling at that time for many different reasons.
Right. This is the farm crisis of the 80s.
So that was the big difference in that. And let me say something about Speaker Murphy. Speaker Murphy made sure that the rural parts of Georgia were fairly treated. But he also looked out for the urban part of Georgia. He was a good balancer of economic conditions, and most of his leadership came from rural Georgia. His chairman he appointed, and a lot of the leadership was from rural Georgia, which kept a good balance for the state economy.
You're talking about agricultural issues and the issue, the trouble the farms were facing in the 1980s. What were some of the pieces of legislation or policy that you were trying to implement in the 80s to alleviate some of this suffering and trouble farmers and rural Georgians were facing?
Well, the farmers were really they were fighting for survival. They had no control over the markets. The labor was uncertain. Their financing was difficult. One of the big things that I found, and it was brought to my attention a lot, is that the property tax was really a problem for the big landowners, in that they were having difficulty paying the taxes because the taxes were so high. The state of Georgia is unique in that the local portion of education is funded by property tax.
Right.
So we have one of the largest or highest property tax levies in the Southeast. So I began looking at the property tax and trying to find ways to bring relief to the agricultural community. And I think it was in 1991, I introduced a constitutional amendment called CUVA, Conservation Use Valuation Assessment, in which the Department of Revenue would set the values on farmland based on its ability to produce a crop and not on its real estate value.
Right.
And that was successful. It passed. It was ratified by the people of the state of Georgia. And the bottom line is that it reduced agricultural property land. For those people, they had to commit to a 10-year covenant that they would not develop that farmland for any other uses, keep it in its natural state. And if they were willing to do that, their property taxes would be reduced some 2/3. And that still today, numbers coming out of the Department of Revenue now show that agricultural lands enrolled in CUVA, the agricultural owners saved $268 million a year in property tax.
Well, I guess the question would be maybe from somebody critical of that position or an opponent of that amendment would be, how did the local communities replace that tax revenue that farmers were saving, that the county government or schools were expecting to see?
Some way, when we passed that, let me say this, that the Association of County Commissioners of Georgia, Jerry Griffin was leading that organization.
Right.
And he was at the table when we drew up the legislation.
Right.
And they agreed that to keep this land in its natural state, that it was worth the cost.
Gotcha.
And then, it was sold to the general public. The general public had to pass this.
Right.
So everyone agreed that this was worth the effort, that sure, it was a hit on the local governments.
Right.
And sometimes they had to replace it with higher millages.
Sure.
But this millage was applied to other properties.
I see.
Agriculture was not affected by that because the Department of Revenue set the prices on the land. But they got it through millages. They raised the valuations on other properties.
Right.
The residences of the state of Georgia, the business, everyone paid more taxes. I had to pay more taxes on my residence.
Right.
But I was willing to do that to save this farmland.
Right.
And the general public was willing to do that.
Were there any, right now anyway, very popular, the special purpose local option sales taxes? Were sales taxes, you were on Ways and Means and dealt with tax policy. What was the state of local option sales taxes and options for local communities to raise sales taxes, especially tourists coming through, folks driving through on the interstates and the highways, things like that? Well,
during that time, the first special purpose local option sales tax was levied, and I think it was in Cobb County. I think it was done by Representative Joe Mack Wilson and one other that I don't recall his name right now. But anyway, that was the first local. That sales tax was popular.
Right.
And that was supposedly to be for Cobb County only. It finally was made statewide, so all communities would have an opportunity to get additional revenues through a sales tax.
And that the voters would levy on themselves.
That's right. The voters had to approve that levy, and they agreed to pay that. And most voters had rather pay sales tax than property tax. I found that out over
just
25 years.
Pennies here, pennies there.
That's right. It's a penny, and you pay it as you go, and you just get accustomed to it. And all of those local option sales taxes had to be renewed. They had to be levied for a specific amount of time,
sure,
for a specific amount of money, and the projects were also had to be listed.
Right.
I introduced another piece of legislation. It was a educational special purpose local option sales tax for education. All of the schools were having trouble finding money to build buildings and for capital outlay projects. And I came up with the idea to give the school systems an opportunity to levy a 1% local option sales tax. I introduced it, I've forgotten the year I introduced that, but it flew through the legislature.
Sure.
I went to Speaker Murphy to start with to tell him about my idea. He signed on to it, he agreed to it. It flew through the House, it flew through the Senate, and we created the 1% educational special purpose local option sales tax. And I think every school system in the state of Georgia now levies that 1%, and it still cannot be spent for maintenance and operations or salaries, anything like that. It has to be capital outlay. There have been attempts to allow a portion of it to be used for M&O. They have all been defeated. That was my original purpose, and I always felt like that if the people who had to ratify the levy, if the people could see the bricks and the mortar, if they could see where the money went, they'd vote for it. If they spent it for M&O, they would stop levying that tax. And I think that's true today. So if they could see the bricks and mortar, and it's one of the greatest tools for financing new buildings for education that we have.
Were you involved in any of the discussions and negotiations and debate over QBE, quality basic education, back during the Joe Frank Harris administration?
I came in the second year of Joe Frank Harris's administration, and I think that's when QBE, I was one of those freshmen sitting on the sideline, and nobody asked me what I thought, and
right.
I stayed out of the fray.
Sure.
I got my one vote, and I was not involved in that fray.
Right. Some of the other policies, when you came to visit us in Athens, we talked about were hot button issues of county consolidation, other sorts of decentralizing state government and moving state government buildings out of Atlanta into Macon and some of the rural areas, especially agricultural departments and things like that. And those were real pet projects of Kill Townsend, who was one of those handful of Republicans, a Buckhead Republican. Why didn't county consolidation ever go anywhere?
No county wants to lose its identity. I was there. I saw the results of that effort. There was a hearing, I think, in Americus, Georgia, where Representative Townsend came down to sell his program. And we had counties like Baker County and Mitchell County, and they were suggested to become one county. Baker County didn't want to lose its identity. In fact, they were fighting mad not to lose it. And that's where most every county felt. And I was told that Representative Townsend had to be escorted out of Americus for his own safety because the issue became such a hot button issue, and it never went anywhere.
Right, right. So you mentioned redistricting earlier in the context of redistricting county commission seats. I guess the first time you would have dealt with redistricting legislative and congressional seats would have been 1991 after the 1990
That's
census.
correct.
Tell me about your experiences with redrawing legislative maps
The first thing you need to realize when you start talking about reapportionment, redistricting, is you do not have a friend in the legislature. Most of the time, with the growth that the state of Georgia was experiencing, most of it was being concentrated in the urban areas, and rural areas were tending to lose population.
Right.
So that meant that with the growth, we needed additional people in each district. But you were taking most of the growth and creating new districts in the metro area.
Right.
You were consolidating districts in rural Georgia. Mm-hmm. I know most of the time I had to go out and try to find 5,000 to 10,000 people for my district. And where do you go to look for them? Your neighbor. You have no friends. You try to take their area, their people, so your district can survive. And that's pretty well true. And a lot of rural districts disappeared, went to the urban areas.
Sure.
So it eliminated representatives, and only the strong could survive. That's why, it was great that I had 10 years of background. I was growing in leadership. I had the ability to protect my turf, whereas the newer people, the new kids on the block, some of them disappeared.
You were Speaker Murphy's friend at this point.
Oh, that's right. I was on the right side at that point.
So tell me, how many, and obviously we vote and apportionment is based on people, not acreage, but how big did your state house district get in terms of square miles? Some of these rural South Georgia districts could be very large in expanse.
I was fortunate. I always had my home county, Mitchell County,
right,
solid. It was not split. I had that as my base, which was around 23 to 25,000 people. If I remember right, the legislative districts around them were around 37, 40,000. Mm-hmm. Colquitt County, our adjoining county, was part of Representative Marcus Collins' district back in those days.
Sure.
So Colquitt County was one of those counties that had population growth. So I was able to get additional people from Colquitt County. I had a concise district most of the time. Most of the time, there were only 2 counties involved.
I see.
I remember, I served 25 years. At one time, I had part of Decatur County. At one time, I had part of Thomas County. But at most, small portions of 2 other counties, but primarily Colquitt and Mitchell counties comprised the majority of my district.
So
there were representatives, and one of them still up there, Representative Gerald Green.
Mm-hmm.
He must have 7 or 8 counties over there on the west side of Georgia. They're small counties and a lot of geographic area.
Sure. So 1991, there's redistricting, and 2001, very controversial redistricting period with Governor Barnes and Bobby Kahn. How did that 1991 redistricting compare to 2001, where you saw the return of multi-member districts and a lot of cracking of counties and things like that?
That redistricting was terrible. We saw a lot of manipulation. We saw fingers running in from one county to another to get population areas. I have a little story to talk about that.
Sure.
Going back to Speaker Murphy, and this dealt with congressional reapportionment. Representative Saxby Chambliss was a Republican.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Murphy decided he wanted to eliminate him. So he ran a finger from Jack Kingston's district over in Savannah into Colquitt County to Saxby's home address and captured Saxby Chambliss and put him in a district with Jack Kingston. Saxby blamed that on me. I went to see Speaker Murphy. I said, Speaker Murphy, this is terrible. I'm going to get credit for what you've done. He looked me right in the eye and said, son, get used to it. So anyway, that was passed. What it did, though, it was probably the best thing ever happened to Saxby. He decided to run for the Senate. Mm-hmm. And he did, and he was successful there. And Jack Kingston district still, I don't know if it still has that finger in Colquitt County or not.
I don't believe so. I think after 2010, Austin Scott's district runs straight down, because you've got Mr. Bishop, Sanford Bishop, and then Austin Scott, and then I think Buddy Carter is in the first coastal district.
Okay, well, at one time Saxby was going to be in a district with Jack Kingston, but that didn't pan out. Saxby went to the Senate and stayed there as long as he wanted to be there.
Right. So one of the most controversial issues, and there were many in the 90s and early 2000s, but probably the most controversial or hot button was changing the state flag.
Oh, Lord.
Governor Miller suggesting the change before the Olympics, and then Governor Barnes's effort later on. Tell me about those 2 different efforts and why one succeeded where the other failed.
Well, I think that was, and I think later on that I'm going to call him Governor Miller, admitted that was probably one of the worst mistakes he ever made in trying to change the flag. It never was a popular thing to do. People were torn between it, but most of the people in southwest Georgia did not approve of changing the flag. I don't really remember. I don't think I voted to change the flag when the Miller effort was there. When the effort came up by Governor Barnes, I voted for changing the flag, not retaining the current flag.
Right.
I voted to change the flag. I knew it was probably not the most popular thing for my district. And I recognized that I would have opposition because of that one vote. And sure enough, that was probably the first time I'd had opposition since my first election.
Well, what convinced you to vote to change the flag there in 2000, 2001?
I don't want to sound like a religious nut, but I've taught Sunday school over 30 years. And my lesson, the week before that flag vote was about stumbling blocks. You don't put stumbling blocks in front of anybody. I was convinced in my mind that the flag, even though I love the flag, I love the design of the flag, was a stumbling block for the minority population. And that made up my mind to vote, you know. And there were a lot of people that watched me that day on that vote and followed me on the vote. And it didn't have an overwhelming majority vote, but it passed. And I got opposition, and fortunately the people of my district liked Richard Royal, and they returned me to the House.
Right. Well, one of the, looking back again to the 1980s and 1990s, one of the most pressing, and we've touched on this a bit with the farm crisis, but when you had the issue of the two Georgias, that you had one Georgia, the urban and suburban Georgia, that was growing, was dynamic, the economy was growing, population was growing, and mostly rural Georgia was declining, stagnant growth, negative growth. Has that problem improved or deteriorated since your time in the legislature?
Well, Governor Joe Frank Harris hated for anyone to say that two Georgia.
He did not like that one.
But let me tell you, there is, probably still is now, two Georgia economies. Atlanta growth was unprecedented. Rural growth was stunted. Agriculture was unpredictable in terms of commodity pricing. We were going through a lot of research and crop production efficiencies there, which we've improved vastly in later years, but there was a real difference. In fact, the first real speech I ever made on the floor of the House was entitled, "All is Not Well in the State of Georgia." And I went through this litany. I still have a recording of that speech I gave, but I went through the litany of how things were bad for the farmers down here. They were having foreclosures on their land. They were going out of business. They were looking for other occupations. And Atlanta just didn't understand.
Sure.
The legislators from up there didn't understand. Everything was fine. Everything was great. But they didn't walk in our shoes. So, I still see that. The rural areas of Georgia do not grow, and I understand the reasons why. Everybody wants to be close to Hartsville Airport. They want the metro economy. They want the population opportunities. But rural Georgia struggles today in certain areas. We have a 4-lane that ran through Mitchell County the whole time I was elected. It never brought jobs.
What was that? Was that specifically one of the so-called developmental highways?
Right, and with Georgia 300, it ran all the way down to Thomasville. That's another story about Tom Moreland. Tom Moreland would not 4-lane it from Thomasville to the Florida line. Once I sided with him, all of a sudden that became a good project. And he authorized the 4-laning of US 19 300 from Thomasville to the Florida line.
I mean, I can vouch as somebody who just drove down 319. It's very nice having 4 lanes. You're not stuck behind a tractor or a log truck or something like that.
I never did see any evidence that it brought a lot of industry to rural Georgia. It was nice. I ran back and forth weekly to Atlanta. It was nice to say I had a 4-lane all the way up there. But as far as bringing in jobs, I never experienced that side of the development.
So you were part of creating the Office of Rural Development, is that right?
That's correct.
Was that in response to these issues that you're talking about right now, an effort to consolidate in one office somebody who could oversee these issues?
Yes, we wanted to share the growth of the state of Georgia and create opportunities for all of Georgia. We've seen a lot of lip service to rural development, but haven't seen a lot of results created that could be attributed to those efforts. Today they're still talking about rural broadband. They're doing all of that. I live 10 miles outside the city of Camilla. My Wi-Fi is probably the worst there is. We still don't have the same type. I enjoy going to Atlanta during the legislative session, have me an apartment. I have the fastest Wi-Fi I've ever had. I come back home and there is a difference, and there are two Georgias still.
Well, I mean, I guess I'm going to ask it, but if you had the answer, we probably wouldn't be sitting here. But what is the magic formula? What is the silver bullet that would? What are the policy prescriptions that would help, in your opinion?
Well, of course, it all boils down to money and finances and economic development. But I understand part of the problem is in the rural areas of Georgia, we don't have the people densities. We have the rural electric, the REAs, the Mitchell EMCs, all the EMCs. They have a large area they have to cover. They have to run many miles of wire, and it's really not cost effective to do that.
Sure. Economies of scale.
That's right. That's right. So, that's a problem, and I recognize that. And, of course, there's a tendency of the people, I'm not going to go there.
Well, what's the role? What role can the federal government, or should the federal government and the state government, how can they work together? Because if you're talking about population density and the cost, and you mentioned the REA. The REA is an example of something where it simply wasn't cost effective to create that infrastructure. Right. So is there a role for the federal government to play in rural areas that have been overlooked?
I think the federal government and state government should provide opportunities to help resolve some of these issues, but still economy of scale has to come in somewhere. Somebody's got to pay the bill. Right. And I recognize that. A lot of people don't recognize that, but I hesitate to say the federal government ought to just bite the bullet and pay for that. We're building one of the greatest deficits we've ever done right now, and I think that my great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren will be paying for the monies we're giving away right now. The local and state and federal governments cannot be the great savior for everyone. We've got to pitch in and help, and we got to earn our stripes, and we got to recognize that it's got to be an efficient investment to make these things happen.
Sure.
And it's going to take time.
Well, switching gears a little bit, back to politics and party politics. Were you surprised when Sonny Perdue, State Senator Sonny Perdue, switched parties in the late '90s and decided to make a run for governor as a Republican?
I was surprised. I had a good working relationship with Sonny when he was in the Senate. In fact, Sonny would carry some of my House bills in the Senate, and I would carry some of his Senate bills in the House, and we worked together. I remember getting on a plane and flying around selling some type of legislation one year, and we were both in the same parties at that time, and we were both trying to sell that legislation and going around the state. But I was surprised when he switched parties, and I was surprised when he announced that he was running for governor. My first reaction was that he didn't stand a chance.
A very common
misperception,
I suppose.
That was my first assessment of it, and I was fooled. And it was time for change in the state of Georgia. And I think sometimes parties get complacent and they don't do their homework a lot. And we can see that happening now. There's always a correction somewhere down the line. And I was in the Democratic Party when the big correction was made. And we all saw it coming. It came faster than we thought it would. But, I think the timing was there. And we had a great influx of people coming in from out of state. I think they tended to be very conservative, and I think that in the metro areas made the difference. But if you don't do your homework, and if you don't stay engaged, and you don't communicate with the people will correct the problem for you. And there was a big correction made.
So, you had Jack Hill, the late Jack Hill, switched parties. A couple other state senators, gave control of the state senate to the Republican Party after that 2002 election. But probably the most immediate impact of 2002 was Speaker Murphy's loss. He was defeated by Mr. Heath, Bill Heath.
That's right.
What was it like when you learned that Speaker Murphy had lost that election? What was your reaction?
Oh gosh, there was scrambling going on. Who was going to be the next speaker? And we started dividing up into groups. One supported this candidate, one supported that candidate. Terry Coleman emerged as one candidate, and Larry Walker emerged as the other candidate. And there was an intense search for people on each side to see who could get a majority. Going back to Speaker Murphy's loss, Speaker Murphy had decided, I was pretty close to him at that time, he had decided he wasn't going to run again. We had a redistricting. He gave a lot of his district to Bill Cummings. And then Speaker Murphy decided at the last minute that he had to run again. He just couldn't give it up. And he had lost a lot of his population base.
Sure.
And he lost Bill Heath. But there was an all-out effort, like every day of the week, recruitment going on for either Terry Coleman or Larry Walker. Groups would gather in Atlanta and have a location, and they would be on the phone all day long, different individuals calling other ones trying to get commitments. And this went on right on up to the night before the election of the new speaker. And I was involved in it. I had chosen Terry Coleman as my candidate. Larry Walker was my friend. But in politics, sometimes you have no friend. You have to make decisions. And I did what I selected Terry because I thought he'd make the best speaker. And the night before the election, we had one individual that came across who brought a few people with him, which made the difference.
Were there efforts to, because if I recall correctly, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the House was pretty evenly divided. It was much closer than when you first got there, when there were only 20 or 25 Republicans.
Right.
Was there an effort to recruit some Republicans to vote for a certain speaker candidate over the other?
Not an all-out effort. Most of it was a selection of Democrats. Now, I understand that Sonny Perdue got involved in Larry Walker's election to some extent.
Both from Houston County.
Right. And trying to ensure that Larry would be the speaker, and then at that time possibly lead to a Republican takeover. But anyway, it went right down to the night before the election that we didn't know it was that close from the two different parties, and the next day Terry Coleman won.
So what was it like, when we started this interview, we were talking about one party control and one party dominance. What was it like trying to legislate during divided government?
Terrible.
Democratic House?
Terrible. Partisan politics is just terrible. When you have issues decided on which party you belong to rather than is it good for the state of Georgia, the people, that's bad government. And we had that then, and we have it now. Each party was trying to one up the other party. And partisan politics is ugly. And it has very damaging side effects in that you get a lot of bad legislation because issues are not being heard on their own merit. They're being heard based on which party you belong to.
Right.
And that's not good lawmaking.
So what do you think, you mentioned that the state was going through a sort of realignment period. Why do you think the Republicans were able to consolidate control over state government as quickly as it did between 2002 and 2010? Over that period of time, Republicans they took supermajorities in both houses, governor's mansion, every statewide elected official. Why did the Democratic Party seem to crumble, for lack of a better word, and the Republicans seize control as quickly as they did?
I think the Democratic Party folded because there was a lack of leadership and a lack of communication among the members of the party. They became complacent. They never dreamed that it could happen to them. And some of us saw it coming a lot quicker. The Republican Party was talking to me, and I thought I had another 2 years before I had to make that decision. They were trying to recruit me.
Right.
And I had a loyalty to the Democratic Party, even though I saw that the Democratic Party was becoming more liberal in the state of Georgia. I didn't agree with it. I was always a conservative Democrat.
Sure.
And, from day one. But I thought the party had left me. And I didn't feel part of the party. And I felt disenfranchised. And it was a difficult lesson to learn from being in the majority and walking across the street to LOB to your new office. Mm-hmm. That's a bad trip.
Walking from your office in
From
the Capitol building
that's
over
right,
to Coverdale.
walking from my Capitol office across the street to my new office.
Right. Your new smaller office.
Yeah, those are hard lessons.
Right.
And, a lot of people never did see it coming. They just didn't understand.
Right.
But they were not paying attention to what's going on. They weren't listening to the people. The people were telling all along that they wanted more conservative government. Nobody was listening except the Republican. And they, one thing is real easy, and the Republicans, before they took over, it's real easy to be against everything. You be against it. You get a lot of popularity. I saw many members up there at the House that I never understood how they got reelected because they voted no on everything. But there are people like that. And we as the Democratic Party did not read the tea leaves as quickly as we should have. But I can see some of that happening today. And depending on how the Republican Party reacts, they need to get on the same page. They're divided. And when you got a divided party, that's when you have big problems.
Well, tell me about it, because when you did eventually switch parties and join the Republican Party, how did the Republican Party, its leadership, its operations, differ from the Democratic Party, their leadership, the way the Democratic Party operated, at least in the House, which was your experience?
Well, the House, they were more conservative. They pretty well were organized. They stuck together. They weren't splintered as they are now. Mm-hmm. Everybody was on the same page. The Democratic Party, when we had the downfall, was really splintered. We had the conservative Democrats, we had the liberal, we had the demographics that came into play. I would say that we had a void in leadership in the Democratic Party when it went down.
Right. let me get your take on this, that the Democratic Party, you never really needed a party organization because you had, you being the Democrats, the Democratic Party of Georgia, had power. They held the levers of government. So a party organization wasn't nearly as necessary. And once that power was gone, there was nothing left standing.
Right. We just didn't pay attention to what the times were asking for.
Sure.
I don't know how to explain it.
Sure. So why did you choose to step away from politics when you did in 2008? So you switched parties. What year did you switch parties?
I think it was in 2005.
Sure.
Yeah, you know.
So you had at least one full term as a Republican.
Right.
Why'd you decide to step away when you did?
The Republicans were good to me. They tried to recruit me prior to their takeover. And as I said earlier, I thought we had 2 more years before that was going to happen. At that time, I was pretty well assured that I would remain chairman of Ways and Means if I went with them, sort of like Jack Hill did.
Right, with appropriations.
I did not take them up on that, so I had to start all over again. But the Republicans were good to me. They created a committee for me to chair. They created, drawing a blank, Budget and Fiscal Affairs Committee, so that I'd be a chairman once more. They wanted me in there. They wanted my institutional knowledge. They wanted my tax knowledge. I still served on the Ways and Means even though I wasn't chair. But they created this other committee and brought me in and made me part of the leadership, let me go to all the leadership meetings. So they were good to me. What made me decide not to offer for re-election again was the leadership of the Republican Party. I had no respect for the leader.
And this would have been the Speaker?
That's correct. And this is edgy that we're talking about now, but I would come home and he was in the newspaper quite often, some of his activities. And people would ask me, Richard, this is your leader? That bothered me. So that was the reason I quit.
Gotcha.
I didn't, I couldn't respect the leadership of the Republican Party.
Well,
there were good individuals in other leadership positions, but the number one leader, and it proved, he proved to be a loser. He didn't last long. Had I known there was a David Ralston that was going to be Speaker in a couple of years, I'd still be there. I believe I could have kept getting elected.
Right.
In my district. But I didn't see that happening, and that's why I left.
So 25 years, looking back on it, reflecting on it, what pieces of legislation do you think, are you most proud of shepherding from idea, from concept into implementation?
Well, the conservation use or CUVA issue, that was one of them. It was a constitutional amendment. The educational SPLOST was another one. I had one other constitutional amendment that I introduced and was passed in 2008, my last year there. It was called the Forest Land Protection Act. It was similar to CUVA, but it applied primarily to forest land. Governor Sonny Perdue knew I had the CUVA background, and he called me one day and said, Richard, I've been meeting with the forest landowners, and they have a problem in the state of Georgia. Their property taxes are way too high. And we started looking at it. And the average property tax, they were not eligible for CUVA because CUVA had certain ownership requirements. It only could be a family farm entity.
Right.
most of the forest landowners were big corporations or LLCs and things like that, so
Right.
they did not qualify for CUBA. He says their average property tax is $20 to $21 an acre. The average property tax in the surrounding states is $2 to $3 an acre. They've convinced me they have a problem. Would you try to create a program similar to CUBA for the forest landowners? So I said yes, I'd look at it, and I did.
Okay. So we were talking about CUVA for forest land owners, and this was during the Sonny Perdue administration.
Right. So anyway, I agreed to try to assist the forest landowners in creating a program similar to CUBA for forest landowners. We had all the forestry industry there. I asked the governor, I said, any particular things you want built into this? He says, I want no ownership requirements. They don't have to be U.S. citizens. We want open entry into the program. So that really simplified it. All you had to do to enter still required a covenant, but this year, the first covenant was 15 years. You had to sign up for a covenant for 15 years that you would not develop your forest land. You'd keep it in its natural state, keep the trees growing. And in return, you could enter a program. It would be based on the same land values that were for CUBA, the same tables, but you could have the benefit of that. We also said we would no longer tax the trees on the land every year. We would tax them one time when they were harvested.
Okay.
So that was a major portion of this legislation. Well, wait a second. That was part of, I'm getting a little confused, that was part of CUBA. We took the timber off of the land.
This is off the original CUBA legislation.
On the original CUBA. So,
I see.
So the trees were not being taxed when we did the Forest Land Protection Act. And we had no ownership requirements. You had no acreage requirements. You had a 2,000 acre limitation in CUBA. There is no acreage limitation in Forest Land Protection Act, which is called FLPA, F-L-P-A. But we had the same values on the land, and people started signing up for that. There was some reluctance because of the 15-year covenant. Sure. Some big landowners could not afford to take there was a big penalty involved if you broke this covenant. The penalty involved a double penalty on all the money you saved in property taxes for the whole acreage. So a lot of people would not sign up for it because of that penalty, and later on we reduced the 15 years to 10 years, so it's now a 10-year covenant. But anyway, the numbers today is it's saving forest landowners some $40 million a year in property taxes. And we're down now, for those people who are involved in the Forest Land Protection Act, their average property tax is around $6 an acre now, whereas it was close to $20 before. It's still higher than our competition around the surrounding states, but that's because of still funding education through property tax. But anyway, those three pieces of legislation are the ones that I feel, and you know, those pieces of legislation got me nominated for the Agricultural Hall of Fame at the University of Georgia.
That's right.
And that's $268 million every year for CUBA, $40 million every year for FLPA. And there's a different thing with FLPA too that we did, and the only way we could pass FLPA because the local governments had caught on to this was costing them money. So we put a reimbursement mechanism in there that any loss in state revenue or any loss in sales tax revenue for local governments would be reimbursed by the state of Georgia. Now, Governor Perdue went ballistic on that when I put that provision in there, but I was working with ACCG, the Association of County Commissioners, And the only way they would support it if we had that mechanism in there. So I put it in there.
Right.
Governor Perdue didn't like it. He told me he didn't like it. But Governor Perdue cannot veto a constitutional amendment. So I put the language in the constitutional amendment. It passed the 2/3 vote in the House and the Senate and the people of Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't sign it, didn't have to sign it. It was law.
That's right.
And he never did like that provision.
I can imagine. I can
But,
imagine.
you know, and that $40 million a year is reimbursed by the state of Georgia.
Right.
And some of the budget writers still don't like it. But it was the right thing to do and the only way we could have passed it and created the property tax relief that we created.
Well, you were talking about Governor Perdue. Another Republican governor, Governor Deal, appointed you to the Jekyll Island Authority to chair the Jekyll Island Authority. What was your experiences in the legislature dealing with issues related to the coast or coastal Georgia, Jekyll Island, and how did that carry over to your time on the authority?
Well, of course, you know, the authority had all types of mechanisms in not so much property taxes, but in fees.
Right.
The state of Georgia owns all the land on the island. They had 50-year leases for the residences over there. They had them for the hotels and everything. So we were collecting most of our revenue on that. But we had one problem. The island, all of the buildings on the island, they were getting close to the 50-year stage when I was on the authority. Nobody was spending any maintenance money. The hotels were becoming terrible to inhabit, and they were essentially letting the buildings disintegrate.
Because they had no incentive.
That's right. No, they were at the end of the lease. The state of Georgia owns the land. They own the building at the end of the 50-year lease, so nothing left. Mm-hmm. So they were reluctant to invest new money. So we went in there and we promised, we had one other factor. We were close to maximum development. By law, you can only develop a small percentage of the whole island.
Right.
So to build something new, we had to tear something down.
Right.
So we went in there and started offering new leases, new 50-year leases for hotels, for houses and things. And people started taking us up on that. It was slow go to start with, but we had some big investors come in there and build some nice facilities, and they're still doing it. And that was really one of the, I used to do a lot of public speaking, civic clubs, about Jekyll Island. And I always wound up saying it was the best non-paying job I ever had. Because you could see this creation of a totally new island. All new facilities, all new infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And the people over on the coast were just starving for something like that. And I don't know if you've been over there recently, but it's something to behold. It's a beautiful place, and I was honored to have a small portion of that time. I was chairman for 4 years there, and a lot of that redevelopment went on during that period of time.
I'll admit the Sea Turtle Center is my daughter's favorite place to visit in Georgia. So that's where her love of sea turtles comes from.
I think that's true with a lot of people. My wife likes the Sea Turtle Center too.
Right.
But I was there for the ribbon cutting on the Westin Hotel, and I was there for the groundbreaking for the Westin Hotel. I remember that shovel out there and nothing there, and then cutting the ribbon on that new facility, and take a great deal of pride in all of that. The new 4-H center was done while I was chairman down there, and it's just a beautiful island now.
Well, let's zoom out a bit and talk more generally about politics and Georgia politics. We talked about why the Republicans were able to consolidate power so quickly, but why do you think the Democratic Party was able to hold on to power so long, especially when the party's coalition was so diverse? Rural, conservative, liberal, urban, suburban. Why do you think they were able to hold on to power up until 2002, mid-2000s?
Because they control the purse strings of the state of Georgia. They control the money. And they kept competition away through the budgetary process. That's the only way I could see it. They did not see it coming as quickly. They could see some of it happen, but you had a lot of groups that wanted to be in control of the Democratic Party who didn't have the best interest of the. I don't need to go there.
Well, why do you think it took the what I used to say is why the Democratic Party of Georgia hasn't made a comeback, but after 2018 and 2020, it does seem that the Democratic Party of Georgia is making a comeback. Why do you think it's making a comeback and becoming a more competitive state now, rather than over that previous 15 or so years?
Well, just like the Republicans, the Democrats, it's much easier, as I said earlier, to be against everything. They're against everything. They're pointing out the flaws in the Republican philosophy that is there. The Republican philosophy sometimes excludes a certain population from being active in government. So, the Democratic Party has tried to sell itself on being the party of the people and not the party of the affluent. And I think that sells pretty good in the demographics that we have in the state of Georgia now.
Were you surprised that President Biden was able to carry the state of Georgia last November?
I was surprised, and I think part of that reason is that some of the Republican Party felt like they were being disenfranchised. And I think the polls will back it up that they didn't go back and vote. They stayed away in some of the second elections, especially the Senate elections. Now, I think that the story that the Democrats said that sold, that they are selling, that people are disenfranchised by the Republican Party, I think that played a role also in the presidential election.
Well, it looks like, looking at the results from 2018 and 2020, is that the state seems to be going through another realignment period where, we talked originally that the Republicans in the state of Georgia back when they were 20-30 were in suburban areas of the state like that. But now the suburbs seem to be trending more towards the Democratic column, while rural Georgia is becoming more and more Republican. What do you think's driving that realignment in the suburbs and in the countryside?
I think a lot of it has to do with the leadership of the Republican Party, and we see a lot of people, a great number of people who still support the former president. And they're not turning loose of the fact that he lost. And I think this is causing divisions in the Republican Party. And the Republican Party is split along these lines. You have the conservatives, you have the people who feel like the elections were not honest, and that's a hard thing to correct. People aren't turning loose of it. They're not accepting the fact that the people of Georgia voted a different way than what they thought it should be.
So looking ahead in your own career, what's next for Richard Royal? What are your current projects and what are your next projects before we wrap up?
I'm working primarily with agricultural entities. I still do a lot of legislative drafting in terms of tax issues. I've got a lot of knowledge in the tax area. I've got a lot of ideas in how we can make government more efficient with our tax incentives and things like that. So I have a good number of entities that still think I know a little bit about taxes, and I consult with them.
Sure.
And you know, Richard Royal, getting on up in age, I'm a firm believer in staying active. And,
Right.
You know, I was in Atlanta January, February, and March of this year. Probably be up there next January, February, and March. But I'm staying active. I'm involved here. I just moved offices. Don't have any intentions.
Not slowing down anyway.
No. Most of my friends that went home and sat on their sofa are no longer with us.
Well,
And I recognize that fact.
there's a good lesson in there.
Right.
Well, Richard, thank you very much for taking this time this afternoon to talk some history and politics with us for the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project.
Thank you for this opportunity. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you very much, sir.